want to learn how to use Jung's psychological types, we have to understand four basic areas. First, we need to understand what Jung meant by introversion and extroversion and the four functions. Second, we have to see how his typology relates to the process of individuation. Third, we have to really see what Jung was talking about. And fourth, we should look at some of the places where typology can be applied. Out of these four areas, the third and fourth are what we are going to concentrate on, because if these areas are neglected, then our efforts in understanding psychological types will bear little fruit. Let's quickly review Jung's basic terminology. Jung started off with the ideas of introversion and extroversion, and he came to these ideas through his efforts to understand himself and his patients and the differences that existed between him and Freud and Adler. Picture yourself having a source of energy which, like a beam of light, can be either turned and focused on the world around you with all its people and places, or turned within and focused on your inner world of dreams and fantasies. If this energy is focused outwardly, this is extroversion. If the beam of light is pointed within, this is introversion. It's important we avoid a mistake in our understanding of these terms right at the beginning. All of us are both introverted and extroverted. To use our example, if most of the beam of light is focused outward, there is still some that illuminates our inner life. And so when we call ourselves an extrovert, it is simply a matter of predominance, of which way the most energy flows. In the case of introversion, most of the light shines inward, but some of it is turned outward. If we didn't have both introversion and extroversion, we simply couldn't survive. We would either be so directed to the world around us that we would lose sight of who we are and our own personality would vanish, or would be so wrapped up inside ourselves we couldn't function when it came to our daily tasks. But usually one direction of these ways the energies flow is stronger than the other, and this is what makes us an introvert or an extrovert. Well, Jung started talking about introversion and extroversion around 1913, and he was satisfied for a while with its explanatory power. But the more he observed himself and the people he came in contact with, the more he grew uneasy. Finally, after years of work, he decided his explanation had been too simple. He had gotten hold of something important, but he had not seen it clearly enough. He realized that there were really four kinds of introversion and four kinds of extroversion. And he described these four kinds of introversion and extroversion in terms of the four functions. Once again, it is important that we do not misunderstand what Jung is saying. The four functions were never meant by Jung to stand alone. To go back to our example of the beam of light that can be turned inward or outward, well, for Jung, this beam of light came in four distinctive colors, as it were. The four functions are distinctive ways or kinds of introversion and extroversion. Jung divided his four functions into two pairs. One pair of functions are the ways of perceiving, which Jung called sensation and intuition, and the other pair of functions are ways of judging, and these he called thinking and feeling. Sensation means the use of our senses. It is our seeing, tasting, smelling, hearing, and touching. Intuition is not the perception of the here and now like sensation is, but is the perception of hidden possibilities. It is something like an inspiration or a hunch. We know something. We get an insight. But it is hard to say just where that insight came from. Thinking, which is one of the two ways of judging, is close to how we ordinarily understand the word. It is the organization of our ideas to come to a conclusion and decide whether something is right or wrong. Feeling, like intuition, is a bit harder to grasp. For Jung, it didn't mean emotions, for we all have emotions, but it was another way we judge something. We evaluate a situation or a person by means of our feelings, which tell us whether we like it or not. Jung summarized the four functions like this. Sensation, that is, sense perception, tells you that something exists. Thinking tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not. And intuition tells you whence it comes and where it is going. Once again, it is important to remember that the functions don't stand alone. They describe the different kinds of introversion and extroversion. So we can have an extrovert who directs his energy to the world around him by way of sensation, or by way of thinking, just like we can have an introvert who directs his energy to the world within by way of sensation or thinking or the other functions. And it's important to realize that this world within is just as real as the world without. Well, between the two attitudes and the four functions, we have 8 basic types, which Jung described in detail in his psychological types. And it was in this book that he completed laying the foundations for his typology. Here is a capsule summary of the 8 types that comes from our book, Tracking the Elusive Human. The extroverted sensation type loves to see, hear, taste, touch, and smell the world around him or her. The extroverted intuition type is continually searching out new possibilities in this world. The extroverted thinking type has a plan to carry out. And the extroverted feeling type wants to be in harmony with the world. The introverted sensation type is captivated by the vibrations that the outside world of senses sets off within them. The introverted intuition type is continually searching out new possibilities in this inner world. The introverted thinking type creates interior worlds of ideas, and the introverted feeling type dives deep into the pool of their feelings. If it is true that we have introversion and extroversion, it is just as true that each of us possess all 4 functions. But just as in the case of introversion and extroversion, one is stronger and one is weaker, it's the same with the functions. If, for example, you are an extroverted sensation type, what happens to all the other ways of relating to the world around you and the world within? They still exist. They are part of our very psychological nature, but they are less used, less developed, and more out of focus. If we are relating to the world around us, we can't relate at the same time to our inner world. If we are using sensation and focusing on the here and now, then we can't be sniffing future possibilities by means of intuition at the same time. If we are thinking, we lay aside feeling, and so our own particular gift, the area where we most excel, produces a pattern which creates our whole psychological type. Let me give an example. Let's imagine that I am an extroverted intuition type. Then my least developed function will be introverted sensation. This least developed function, Jung called the inferior function. Of the other two functions of thinking and feeling, one would be in second place as the auxiliary or helping function that aids the first or more developed function in its work, and the other would be less developed. All this sounds a bit complicated, but it can be mastered with a bit of practice. In fact, mastering the terminology of typology is about the easiest part of the whole matter. And this brings us to our second area, which is how Jung's typology relates to what he calls the process of individuation. Individuation was the context that made these terms, these types, come alive for Jung. Put in the simplest terms, individuation is the ongoing relationship between our conscious or ego and the unconscious. Our ego is just part of our total personality, which embraces the unconscious as well. If we are to become fully ourselves, we have to take into account both conscious and unconscious, and not center ourselves in our ego, but find a new center around which the ego and the unconscious can revolve. And this new center is what Jung called the self. Individuation is nothing more than the journey we take in order to arrive at the self. When we look at this journey from the perspective of psychological types, its starting point is our most developed attitude and function. We tend to identify ourselves with this habitual way of relating, which is usually what we are best at. If, for example, I am an extroverted intuition type with a second or auxiliary function of thinking, then I see the world through the tinted glasses of this extroverted intuition. In fact, I have so identified myself with the superior function that I don't even realize that there is any more to my personality than this. And I can even imagine that everyone else is more or less built the way that I am. But if there are 8 basic types, this is certainly not true. And if my way of looking at things represents only one of the 8 ways, then I am missing a lot of life. Individuation, from the point of view of typology, is the way we can encounter those other types that dwell within us. And it is often the third function, which is the starting point for the journey towards individuation. Let's suppose I have been happily exercising my extroverted intuition. I have been constantly entertaining myself with discovering new ideas, new possibilities, and going to new places. Then one day I wake up and find that all these extroverted intuitive activities simply don't grab me the same way as they did before. I imagine I'm in a slump and redouble my efforts to get the same old excitement out of life, but it doesn't work. I've arrived at a dead end. I have used up the psychic energy that was connected with the superior function and with the function that helped it. But having used up this energy, I now feel listless. And I simply can't conceive of where I can look to find new energy because I have so identified my personality with my habitual way of proceeding. A Jungian typologist could say, but where are the other functions like feeling and sensation, especially in their introverted form? Where is the other half of the personality? Well, it is unconscious, and only if we can find a way down to it will we have a chance to become whole. This means we have to work at strengthening our second, and especially our third function, and once we have done this, then to attempt the much greater feat of encountering the fourth or inferior function. But this is extremely difficult. Why? It's because our fourth function is not like our other functions. It can never be fully brought into the light of consciousness. It can never become like the first function, and that is because it is the gateway to the unconscious. It is so rooted in the unconscious that to deal with our fourth function, we have to deal with the unconscious itself. If the fourth function could become fully conscious, it would be like dragging the whole of the unconscious with it and making it conscious, which is like a child playing on the seashore, trying to put the whole ocean in his pail. This concludes our brief overview on type terminology and type seen dynamically in terms of individuation. But if we were to stop here, we would have stopped before we truly got started. Even if we were to spend a great deal of time reading Jung's psychological types and the extensive literature that has grown up about them, that would still be just the beginning. The real issue of types does not reside there. What we need to do is to turn Jung's words, which were born out of his own experience, into our own experience. We have to convert and transform our theoretical understanding of types into real type seeing. We have to take types and remove them from being a somewhat exotic theory and make them into a practical tool that we can use day by day. Now we have finally arrived at the heart of typology. There is nothing more important in typology, and there is nothing harder to do. For it is very difficult for us to really believe and admit that we can't see. Don't we have eyes? And therefore don't we already see? And it is because we think we see, we resist the thought that we have to learn how to see. This is all the more true when it comes to the question of human behavior. We feel that we know ourselves, and we have spent our whole lives surrounded by people. And so in some way we ought to be people experts. Unfortunately, this is not true. Our seeing is conditioned and limited by our type. There are many things we are blind to because they are unconscious. We see with our own particular kind of attitude and function, and don't realize there is much more to ourselves and others than we can see through this particular kind of colored glasses. So the real secret of types is not learning the theory or terminology, but spending the time necessary to learn how to see typologically. Type seeing is an art as well as a science. Let me give you some examples to illustrate the kind of seeing I am talking about. When I first moved to our home in the Anima National Forest in southern Oregon, I found myself surrounded by towering trees. I certainly saw these trees, but my seeing wasn't schooled. I just saw a big bunch of trees. It was only little by little that my seeing came into focus. There were ponderosa pines with their distinctive plates of golden yellow bark. There were white firs shaped like Christmas trees there were sugar pines with enormous pine cones hanging from the tips of their branches. And all these trees, in all their distinctive character, had been there all along, but I simply hadn't learned to see them. Let's imagine going tracking with an expert tracker. If we have no experience ourselves, we'd probably spend most of the time staring blankly at the ground while the master tracker followed what, to us, seemed like nearly invisible smudges and bent twigs and disturbed stones, and told us about the animal that made this track, and how long ago the track had been made, and even what sex the animal was. We would be tempted to believe that the tracker was making all this up, instead of simply reading the signs that were there. And we might only lose our skepticism if our tracker would lead us to a bush, and out of the bush would jump the very animal he claimed to be following. Once we were convinced it was possible to see in this way, then it would still take a real effort on our part to learn to see, to put in the time and effort to school our sight, to actually see what was there all along. We could go through the same kind of process, whether it was a question of wine tasting, or stock judging, or evaluating coins, or any of the many skills that are only acquired by doing. Book knowledge is not enough, but when it comes to psychology, we try to pretend as it is. We have to become type trackers. We have to learn to see in daily life the different types that Jung discovered. Let me try to give you some idea of what this is like. We might be familiar with the words introversion and extroversion, but they don't really sink in until we see them in the flesh. I'm introverted, and long before I knew about types, I was working with a friend raking leaves. I mentally squirmed and thought about everything and anything except the job at hand and the leaves themselves. In short, I was bored. I simply had a lot more energy focused inward than I had flowing outward. And since I was thinking so furiously, trying to think about everything except the leaves, I asked my friend, "What are you thinking about?" And he answered, "Nothing." I was dumbfounded. How could he be thinking about nothing? Much later I realized he was a strong extrovert, probably an extroverted sensation type. He was probably noticing the colors of the leaves and the patterns they made on the lawn and the beauty of the trees and the sun in the sky. All the while I was missing those things because my energy and attention didn't run that way. I was expecting him to have the same kind of introspective attentiveness that I had, and I couldn't imagine him being without it. When we have this kind of experience, and it connects with type theory, so that something clicks, then we have made part of types our own. Every day we are interacting with people, but often we fail to understand the psychological dynamics involved. We look at a tiny part of the picture. We might see the 1/8 that has to do with our own type, and miss the 7/8, or worse, misinterpret it. Let's imagine we're working with an extroverted thinking type. According to psychological types, if this person's most developed attitude and function is extroverted thinking, then his least developed function will be introverted feeling. But it will take some doing on our part to see both sides of his personality. An extroverted thinker can give the impression of being an energetic, can-do kind of guy who uses his head and isn't easily deflected by sentiment. He can be very effective in getting a difficult job done. He sees what has to be accomplished. He has the ability to organize himself, to create a plan to accomplish it. And he has the outward directed drive and energy to go ahead and try to do it. And in the process of trying to get the job done, he often shows little patience for anyone who wants to change his plan or who gets in his way. He can be systematic, orderly, and a bit ruthless. At first we might say to ourselves, well, this man has no feelings. He is simply missing the kind of sensitivity to people that comes from the feeling function. But we would be wrong. He has a feeling function, but since it is his least developed function, it will only show itself at certain times and in certain circumstances. But we have to have our eyes open to see it. You would imagine that it would be hard to hurt the feelings of one of these tough men. But this is not always the case. Sometimes, when they have gone out of their way to offer a helping hand, even in some relatively ordinary matter, and if you show the least bit of lack of appreciation, you can make yourself an enemy. Why? The extroverted thinker has let his feelings come out, and these feelings are delicate and easily rebuffed. At other times, the extroverted thinker will make it clear that he has no use for people who can't stand on their own 2 feet. Yet it will turn around and lavish all sorts of kind attention on animals. A large part of the misery that exists in our relationships with other people comes from the fact that we simply don't understand where they're coming from. If we are an introverted, it's terribly difficult for us to understand that someone else is simply made a different way. If we are an intuition type, it boggles our minds that someone else could happily focus on all those sense details that we ignore. If we are a thinking type, we are incredulous when we have an argument with a feeling type, and the feeling type doesn't use logic or reason to prove their case. They simply say that's how they feel about it. And for the life of us, we can't believe that they have any grounds at all for saying what they do. When it comes to type seeing, we are in the same position as I was when I looked at all those trees. We are actually seeing all sorts of bits and pieces, in this case human behavior, but we have no way of bringing it into focus. We have no way to integrate this material so that it forms a clear picture. Our own behavior and that of the people closest to us can remain an enigma despite the fact we know a great deal about them and ourselves. We simply can't put all this information together. Well, this is what types is meant to do. They are meant to be the organizing framework for helping us understand each other. It's a terrible distortion of typology when somebody criticizes it as a form of pigeonholing, as if the organizing principles displace and cover up the actual behavior and distinctive characteristics of individuals. The truth is just the opposite. Part of the picture we're trying to see is that of the other half of the personality, which is connected with the fourth function. Let's take the case of the introverted intuition type. They are dreamers par excellence. Their energy not only flows inward, but is characterized by intuition, which makes it leap beyond the present and into the future, and so they concern themselves with imaginary or spiritual or all sorts of intangible kinds of realities. These people can be so wrapped up in their dreams and inner visions that you would be led to believe that they don't have the five senses in working order. They forget things, trip over things, can't remember the color of the clothes they are wearing, and in general act like material objects are conspiring against them. Material things hide themselves, break themselves, and sometimes jump out and hit them in the shins. If we truly want to understand this type, and the same holds true of every type, we have to see both sides of their personality. If we only saw the exciting dreams and visions that occupy most of their attention, we might be inclined to conclude, like they often do, that somehow they should be excused from the ordinary affairs of life and be free to pursue this interior work. There is, for example, the way in which the extroverted feeling type makes people glow by directing her strong, focused feelings on them, or the way the introverted sensation type seems to hesitate as he struggles to take in everything around them. Just how can we learn to see these things? The ideal way would be to go out with a master type tracker and follow the tracks with him or her. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of type trackers around, for typology is a relatively new art and science, and has been taking its time moving from a theoretical focus on what Jung said to a more practical focus, in which we would attempt to see what Jung saw. But even without an expert typologist to help us, we can go forward and learn to see typologically. The way to do this is no different than going on our own process of individuation. The more we develop our own type, the more we will realize that in our own distinctive way, we have all the types within us. We will see that we are both introverted and extroverted and possess all four functions. And as we progress, our own growth will give us the ability to see others typologically as well. When we saw only out of the tinted glasses of our conscious function, 7/8 of the world of typology was invisible to us. If we become 7/8 complete within ourselves, we will see the 7/8 of what is around us rather than the 1/8 we saw before. There's a very big difference between recognizing some of the elements of typology in ourselves and in others, and the kind of integral seeing that I'm talking about here. Even beginners in typology can often make rather accurate guesses whether they are an introvert or an extrovert, and which function is most developed, and so forth. In fact, there are tests that have been carefully and conscientiously developed that can help us do this. But even if our perceptions are accurate, or the test has given us the correct answer, which doesn't always happen, this knowledge is the barest beginning of typology. It does us very little good if, for example, we know we are an extroverted feeling type, unless we have some sense of what this means dynamically in terms of the interaction between conscious and unconscious. That's why our own process of individuation goes hand in hand with our real type seeing. Unless we experience, for example, our own fourth function, the fourth function of other people will always remain a rather theoretical entity. Let's turn now and look at some of the many areas where types can be applied. Since typology is about our basic psychological makeup, There is just about no place where we couldn't use it. But there are some areas that are crying out for typological knowledge. The first of these is the whole question of romance and marriage. There is the old saying, opposites attract, and this can certainly be verified typologically in the case of romance and marriage. Just why do opposites attract? Let's take a man who is an extroverted sensation type, with thinking as his second function. The other and unconscious half of his personality would be feeling and intuition in an introverted form. Even if he is unaware of this other side, it is nonetheless a very real and important part of himself. Well, one day he meets an attractive lady and feels a deep inner sense of completion in her company. He feels he has finally found someone who is made for him, and this can be truer than he realizes. If he has not dealt with his introverted side directly, it is very possible for him to project this other side on someone who is an introvert and who has intuition and feeling as their most developed functions. And the lady can project in her turn on him. What we have then is the common situation of falling in love, which often leads to marriage. We're attracted by the other person who in one form or another embodies the unconscious part of our own personality. And that's why when we're together with that person, we feel so complete. Not all marriages, of course, are marriages of opposites, but there are certainly enough of them around to make this a convenient way to look at the question of types in marriage. Marriages of opposites are difficult to live out to the degree that they have started with these unconscious projections. If the husband, in this case, the extroverted sensation thinking type, imagines that he has no psychological journey to go on, in fact, he has found another person who makes him feel complete and sort of relieves him of the responsibility for that other side, even though this isn't a conscious kind of conclusion, he will be abdicating one of his most important responsibilities. And it's the same with the wife. Fairly early in marriage, they can begin to experience the rather terrible realization that the person they married is not at all like they expected them to be. It would take the best will in the world for two people of opposite types to try to understand just what the other person is like. But in this case, each of them is already disappointed when it turns out that the other person is really not that kind of miracle solution to the question of individuation. We see all kinds of normal tensions in marriages, and we can look at these typologically. The introvert likes to be with her spouse or with just a few people at a time, while the extrovert likes to go out or to have a lot of people around. The sensation type is keenly aware of all the details and chores of daily life, at the same time that he's married to an intuition type who's oblivious to them. The extroverted sensation type can become routine-bound and happy to stay within the orbit of his known activities, while one of the deepest needs of the introverted intuition type is a yen for novelty, for something different, which can express itself in a desire for travel or in the study of a new subject. The very attractive force that brought the two people together becomes the force that begins to separate them. What can they do about it? Each person has to seriously go on the journey of individuation, which leads to their own wholeness. The more we come in contact with our other side, the less we will project this other side on other people, and the more we'll be able to understand where they are coming from. There are many, many marriages that are bedeviled by these typological problems and could be helped by a practical knowledge of typology. But once again, this knowledge is not simply the realization that we have married such and such a type, but it is the realization that both of us ought to be helping each other on the journey towards wholeness. Typology gives us a way to look at the typical kinds of conflicts that exist in marriages. For example, there are any number of marriages where the man is an introverted thinking type and the woman is an extroverted feeling type. She's a very social being and seems to draw people to her out of the thin air. He's just the opposite. He prides himself on his hard-headedness and self-sufficiency. Although he is attracted to her precisely because he needs to get in touch with his other side of extroverted feeling, he has a great deal of difficulty coping with his wife's well-developed abilities in this area. He has a constant inclination to rein her in and somehow restrain her effusiveness, and really turn her into a thinking type like he is. If she says, "Well, let's go out," he says, almost reflexively, "We've been going out too much, dear." The extroverted feeling woman has her own kinds of blind spots. She finds it difficult to share in the kinds of things that interest him. She feels he's being a wet blanket and doesn't realize that he is cultivating a whole interior world and can be shy about asking her to share it. The kinds of difficulties that are commonly experienced in marriages can be seen between parents and children as well. There's no law that says our children have to be our own type, especially if our spouse is our typological opposite. If I'm an introvert and I have an extroverted child and don't realize it, I would be tempted to impose my own kind of behavior on the child and be perplexed when the child rebels. We are born with definite psychological types, and one of the crucial ingredients that is lacking from our child rearing is our ability to discern just what type our child is. If we could discover this, we'd have a chance not only of fostering the child's dominant function and dominant attitude, but even more importantly, helping our child cope with their own inferior function. It is not only in marriage and the family that typological knowledge is lacking, but just about everywhere we look. In the normal classroom, the teacher, already overburdened with things to do, is tempted to treat all the children as if they were somehow the same, even though instinctively she knows this is not true. Yet she has neither the time nor the knowledge to cultivate her instincts, which would lead to a genuine appreciation of the types of children she is teaching and the particular ways in which each type learns. The same situation arises in the workplace. When the boss is looking for workers that will somehow be interchangeable with each other and doesn't have the time or inclination or knowledge to realize that each employee has a distinctive psychological type and is better at one kind of work rather than another, the result is trouble. It doesn't make much sense to put an introverted intuition type on the assembly line, or the extroverted sensation type in advanced planning, In all these situations, whether in marriage or school or work, we have developed various stopgap measures by which we try to deal with the differences that we know exist among people. But how much better it would be if we could make our knowledge fully conscious and put it on the firm foundations of Jung's psychological types. How do we actually go on the journey of individuation, this journey towards typological wholeness? This is a serious issue. On the one hand, we find ourselves involved in relationships and personal difficulties that cry out for psychological knowledge. Even if we consider ourselves basically normal and psychologically healthy, we have a tremendous need for the kind of knowledge that typology can bring us. We need it in order to reach our full psychological potential and to save our relationships from fracturing under the stress of projections and misperceptions. If we had a distinctive psychological problem, we would be well advised to find professional help. But what are we going to do when it is not a question of a distinctive illness, but the more general issue of wholeness and health? What are we going to do when we realize there are about 1,000 Jungian analysts in the world, and our chances of having prolonged contact with one of them are negligible? The situation is similar to what we find in the field of nutrition. If we have a particular illness, we ought to seek out a physician, but day by day, we have a pressing need for adequate nutritional information so that we can have a healthy diet, which is vital to our overall health. Well, typology is like good nutrition. It is something we have to take personal responsibility for because we need it if we're going to live fully day by day. But typology is not without its dangers. Once we pass beyond terminology and theory and start on the journey that leads into the depths of our own psyches, we are unleashing forces that are not always easy to deal with. So we reach a dilemma. On the one hand, we are suffering from normal psychological problems that afflict our marriage or our ability to grow. And on the other, if we start to do our own psychological work, there is always the chance that things might get out of hand. What's the answer? I think each of us has to answer for himself and feel our own way towards what are the suitable kinds of psychological journeys we ought to undertake. Let me make this more concrete by talking about the fourth function. The fourth function is no theory. It's our particular weak spot, our sore point. It's the button which, if someone pushes it, we begin to lose our cool. It's the place where we most want to avoid, but which keeps on popping up and forcing its attention on us. If we do nothing about it, it won't go away. It will simply try to trip us up when we are not paying any attention. If we start to deal with it, it can feel like a bitter and painful torment to the ego. There's nothing that the introverted intuition type wants to do less than to take his precious time away from his inner visions and spend it on sense details. There is nothing that the extroverted thinker wants to do less than allow himself to be immersed in his introverted feelings and use those feelings when relating to people. Each of us has his own weakness, and if we begin to deal with this weakness, it can make us more compassionate and tolerant. But if the inferior function is actually connected to the unconscious, then it is simply loaded with energy. Jung says it would be too precipitous for us to begin our typological journey by confronting the fourth function. We have to work our way down to it in steps and gain strength along the way. Oftentimes, as I said before, I have the impression that is our third function where the typological work really begins. Our first and second functions are more or less conscious and developed, and part of the third as well. But there's another part of the third function which is unconscious and undeveloped. And so we face the task of bringing these two parts of the third function together. This is like a first stage of wholeness. In men, it can be connected to what Jung called the Anima. We have different images, both spiritualized and sensual, of women, and these are actually like structural components of our psyche, and we need to somehow fuse these images together. If we can succeed in unifying our third function, we will find that this leads us to the fourth function and the larger issue of the wholeness of the complete personality, both conscious and unconscious. We have to really just start where we are. We can look at our typological development, and everything looks fine from the point of view of the ego, but there might be just one little piece of one of the lower functions that is protruding into consciousness. There might be something that bothers us, something like a sore thumb. If we start working on this piece, if we start pulling on this thread, then the journey will begin. What makes this journey difficult is that we simply cannot see the other half of our personality, which is our destination. That's why Jung stressed the importance of dreams, because dreams are often compensations to our conscious attitudes, and they often portray in graphic ways what this other half of our personality is like. Thus they can give us a picture of this other half, which can help convince us that this other half actually exists. Because despite all our lip service, despite what we say about the reality of the unconscious, we are continually tempted to pretend it really doesn't exist at all. It is possible then for us to record our dreams and try analyzing these dreams from a typological point of view. Then we can see that sometimes the dream characters embody our various functions, and the dream action shows us a movement towards wholeness or conflicts that stand in its way. We can follow this same kind of procedure by analyzing our recurring fantasies and daydreams. If we write down these daydreams and try to look at them objectively, they too can offer valuable typological information. But one of the great advantages of approaching individuation by way of typology is that not only does the job start exactly where we are with our conscious personality, but every day we are confronted with opportunities to increase our typological knowledge. If we lose our temper, we can ask ourselves, now why did I lose my temper, and do I habitually lose my temper about the same kinds of things? And then, does this habitual loss of control shed some light on my own inferior function? If we meet someone we instinctively like or dislike, we can question ourselves, how much of my feelings for this person are based on my own projections coming from the unconscious side of my personality? In fact, in every person we meet, we have the opportunity to learn about one of the 8 types, and this is particularly rewarding when we keep firmly in mind that somehow, in some way, we have the 8 types within ourselves. If my weakest function is intuition, I can learn a lot by watching someone whose strongest function is intuition, but only if I can restrain my own projections. We can even analyze the kind of society we live in from a typological point of view. For example, in the United States, we have a society that is more extroverted than introverted. This is certainly true when it comes to a question of public figures and role models, because these people make good use of their extroverted gifts. Now, while every country has a mixture of all types, it is probably true that the percentages of individual types vary from place to place. If we travel to parts of Germany or Switzerland or England, we would probably find a more introverted population than we are used to here. Just how long does it take to become a true type tracker? I've sometimes been amazed at people who have no typological knowledge at all, who once the basic categories have been explained to them, can accurately decide what their own type is, and sometimes what the type of their spouse is as well. But it's not always this easy. It's possible to make, and I have made such glaring errors that the only real explanation for them, besides pure ignorance, was the fact that I was thrown off the track by my own projections. The degree of our typological objectivity will be related to how well we are succeeding in going on the journey of individuation ourselves. The basic ideas of typology have an instinctive and widespread appeal. That's why the words introversion and extroversion have entered into everyday language, even though in the process they are sometimes misused. But if you have a serious interest in typology, give yourself time. You will meet people, make a rapid estimation of what their type is, which your later experience will confirm. But on the other hand, you will run across situations where it can literally take years to come up with a good type diagnosis. It is even possible to mistype ourselves despite considerable type experience. The reason this can happen is that we are faced with such an overwhelming array of information, because we know ourselves so well, that it becomes very difficult for us to organize all this information into a coherent picture. Yet even when we can't figure out what someone's type is, the very fact that we are working on the question can save us from being frustrated and disheartened about our relationship to that person. Typology is a wonderful skill that is well worth whatever time and energy we put into acquiring it. I sometimes imagine how wonderful it would be if there were typological marriage counselors all around the country, or perhaps even better, typological premarital counselors. There is certainly much more to typology than the indications that I have given here. It would be possible to talk in great detail of what it is like for one person to go on the journey of individuation by way of psychological types, and how this appears in their dreams and their fantasies and their daily conduct. There is also a considerable amount of literature that has grown up around psychological types that we could study as well. And there are other kinds of typologies that could be integrated with Jung's psychological types. I think the most outstanding example is William Sheldon's body types. In summary, we have touched on Jung's type terms and their connection with individuation. but I hope it is clear that the heart of typology is our own efforts to turn Jung's typology into our own way of seeing. Then types can become our own distinctive way to go on the journey of individuation and to enrich our relationships with other people. Type seeing is not always easy, but it is well worth the effort. So stick with it. Interest in Jung's psychology and his psychological types is spreading around the world. Many places in the U.S. have organizations of people interested in Jung's psychology, as well as Jung institutes and societies of professional analysts. If you would like to learn more about Jung's psychology and his typology, look for one of these organizations in your own area.